The next housing crash may not start in London, or Manchester, or Birmingham. It may start 3,500 miles away in a narrow shipping corridor in the Middle East. And if that sounds dramatic, consider this. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. One disruption, one escalation, one geopolitical miscalculation, and the economic chain reaction could reach straight into your mortgage payment. Economists and property analysts have been quietly reviewing decades of market data to understand one question: could rising global tensions trigger the next housing downturn? Over the past 30 days, we examined housing market reports, central bank data, energy supply statistics, and historical conflict timelines stretching back to 2001. The conclusion is unsettling. War alone has almost never crashed the housing market, but the economic shockwaves that follow it sometimes do. And when those shockwaves hit the credit system that finances property, the consequences land directly on you. This is the housing market truth they don't want you to hear. For decades, homeowners have believed one reassuring narrative. When geopolitical conflict erupts, property markets remain stable. Look at the data. When the Afghanistan war began in 2001, UK house prices continued rising. When the Iraq war began in 2003, the property market still climbed. Even after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, housing prices in many developed economies initially continued upward. Familiar pattern, familiar reassurance. But here's what analysts say the headlines rarely explain. Those conflicts happened during an era of extremely cheap credit. Mortgage rates during much of the period between 2000 and 2021 hovered between roughly 1% and 3% in many advanced economies. Cheap borrowing masked deeper risks. But today, the environment looks very different. The Bank of England has already pushed interest rates sharply higher in response to inflation pressures. Mortgage rates in the UK have recently hovered between approximately 5% and 6% for many borrowers. You feel that difference immediately in your monthly payments. Economists say property values do not move primarily because of war, they move because of credit. When borrowing becomes expensive, affordability collapses. Think about what that means for you. A buyer who could afford a £400,000 property at a 2% mortgage rate may only qualify for something closer to £300,000 when borrowing costs double or triple. The house did not change. The street did not change. The schools did not change. But the financing system did. And when financing changes, prices follow. Now add the next piece of the chain reaction: energy. Roughly 1/5 of the global oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a small shipping lane. It is one of the most critical economic choke points on Earth. If tensions in the region interrupt oil shipments, prices can spike rapidly. That spike spreads through the economy in stages. Fuel prices climb, transport costs increase, food prices rise, manufacturing costs jump, and inflation follows. When inflation surges, central banks rarely cut interest rates quickly. They often hold them higher for longer to stabilize prices. The Bank of England took exactly that approach during the energy-driven inflation surge of 2022. Higher interest rates meant higher mortgage costs. Higher mortgage costs meant fewer buyers qualifying for loans. And fewer buyers mean slower housing markets. Now step back and look at the UK housing landscape today. Nominal house prices have risen roughly 35% over the past decade. But when adjusted for inflation, real house prices have actually declined about 14%. That difference matters. It means the apparent boom in property values has already been eroded by rising costs across the wider economy. At the same time, property listings are reported to be at their highest level in more than a decade. More homes on the market, buyers focused on monthly mortgage payments rather than headline prices. and borrowing costs still sitting around 5 to 6%. Analysts outline 3 possible scenarios for the months ahead. In the first scenario, oil prices spike briefly but stabilize quickly, allowing inflation to remain contained and central banks to gradually lower interest rates. In the second scenario, energy prices stay elevated, keeping inflation stubbornly high, and mortgage rates stuck near 5 to 6%. Property values may stagnate even if nominal prices appear stable. And the third scenario is the one economists watch most carefully. A major disruption to global energy supply, oil prices surge, inflation jumps again, recession risk rises, employment weakens. And under those conditions, certain property markets could face real price declines and forced sales. And if you think that scenario sounds extreme, what the next hidden pressure inside the housing system could do to affordability may surprise you even more. The housing market rarely collapses because of one headline. It collapses because pressure builds quietly across the system until something finally snaps. And right now, 2 forces are quietly reshaping the property landscape in ways most buyers barely notice. The first is the affordability trap created by modern mortgage calculations. For decades, buyers focused on one number, the price of the home. But lenders do not think that way anymore. Banks care about one thing, your monthly payment. Think about what that means for you. A buyer who could comfortably borrow £350,000 when mortgage rates were near 2% may only qualify for around £240,000 when rates move closer to 6%. Same salary, same buyer, same neighbourhood, but the purchasing power collapses by more than £100,000. And here's what estate agents rarely highlight in the marketing brochures. That drop in purchasing power quietly drags the entire market downward. Sellers can list homes at any price they want, but buyers can only borrow what the banks allow. You paid for stability expecting predictable borrowing costs. You got a mortgage market that can shift thousands of pounds in affordability overnight. And when the financing system changes that dramatically, the idea of stable house prices hits very differently. But the next pressure point is even more uncomfortable for the housing industry to discuss: inventory. Right now, property listings across parts of the UK are reported to be at their highest level in more than a decade. That means more homes competing for the same pool of qualified buyers. Think about that scale: tens of thousands of properties entering the market while borrowing costs remain elevated. Sellers are adjusting expectations slowly. Buyers are adjusting instantly. Because when mortgage payments jump, the numbers stop working. A property listed for £450,000 may technically still hold that valuation on paper. But if buyers cannot secure financing at that level, the market quietly begins to stall. Transactions slow, price reductions begin appearing, and time on market stretches longer. The housing industry often frames this as a cooling period. But for homeowners trying to sell quickly, that cooling feels very different. When supply rises and credit tightens at the same time, you're not getting the booming property market the brochures promised. You're getting a negotiation battlefield where only the most affordable homes attract serious offers. Now step back and look at the broader system that surrounds this market, because the deeper problem is not just individual buyers or sellers making different choices. The entire global economic structure that kept inflation low for decades is changing. For nearly 30 years, globalization pushed manufacturing across multiple countries, lowering costs and keeping inflation contained. But that model is now shifting. The pandemic exposed fragile supply chains. The war in Ukraine disrupted energy flows across Europe. Governments across the world are now prioritizing domestic production and energy security over pure efficiency. Economists call this a structural shift in the global economy. And structural shifts rarely happen quietly. When supply chains become shorter and less efficient, costs tend to rise. When costs rise, inflation becomes harder to control. And when inflation becomes unpredictable, interest rates often remain higher for longer. Think about the scale of that change. Between roughly 2000 and 2021, mortgage rates near 1 to 2% became normal across much of the developed world. But analysts now warn that the future may look very different. If interest rates stabilize closer to 3 to 4%, mortgage rates could settle in the 4 to 6% range for years. That may not sound dramatic at first, but for the housing market, it represents a completely different financial environment. One where buyers borrow less, transactions move slower, and price growth becomes far less certain. But you don't have to be a victim of this system. And once you understand what's really happening, you become much harder to exploit. By the time housing markets actually crack, the warning signs have usually been visible for months, sometimes years. But most buyers never connect the dots until the pressure lands directly on their own finances. And the most dangerous pressure building right now is not just interest rates. It is the collision between borrowing costs, employment risk, and forced selling. Think about how this works in real life. When mortgage rates sit near 2%, a homeowner might pay roughly £1,200 per month on a £300,000 loan. Push that rate closer to 6%, and that same loan can cost more than £1,900 per month. Nearly £700 extra every single month. For one household. Now multiply that pressure across thousands of borrowers refinancing in the same year. Think about that scale. Every week, in every region, across tens of thousands of households coming off fixed-rate deals signed during the ultra-cheap money era. The payment shock does not appear in headlines. It appears quietly in bank statements. And when monthly costs jump that fast, families start making difficult decisions. Holidays disappear, savings vanish, and eventually, some homeowners face the one outcome no property market brochure ever mentions: forced sales. You paid for financial security, expecting predictable mortgage costs. You got a loan system that can increase your housing expense by hundreds of pounds almost overnight. Now add the economic layer most buyers never consider until it is too late: employment. Housing markets rarely collapse because homes suddenly become worthless. They collapse when enough homeowners lose the income required to keep paying. And that is where the third scenario economists worry about becomes dangerous. A major disruption to global energy supply pushes oil prices sharply higher. Inflation surges again. Central banks delay interest rate cuts. Businesses face higher operating costs, and recession risks rise. When companies cut costs, jobs disappear. When jobs disappear, mortgage payments stop. And when enough payments stop, lenders start repossessing homes. It does not happen everywhere at once. It starts in pockets. One region, one sector, one group of households under pressure. But once forced sales appear in meaningful numbers, prices begin adjusting downward because distressed sellers accept lower offers simply to exit the debt. When that happens, the reassuring narrative that housing always goes up begins to fracture. And the scale of that risk becomes clearer when you consider how many homeowners are exposed to refinancing cycles. Millions of UK borrowers locked in fixed-rate mortgages during the era when rates sat near historic lows. Deals signed at roughly 1 to 2%. Deals that eventually expire. Think about that moment. A homeowner who locked in a 5-year deal in 2020 may refinance into a mortgage rate 3 times higher. The house did not change. The family did not change. But the cost of owning that property suddenly does. That is the hidden vulnerability inside modern housing markets. Not sudden collapse, gradual financial pressure spreading through refinancing waves. When that pressure collides with rising living costs, higher energy prices, and uncertain employment conditions, the risk of forced sales grows. And when forced sales begin appearing across multiple regions, the idea of permanent property wealth looks very different. For many homeowners, that moment becomes the emotional rock bottom. Trapped between rising payments, uncertain income, and a housing market moving slower than expected. But knowledge changes everything. Stop. Take a breath. Because once you understand exactly how this housing system works, you become far harder to exploit by it. The first strategy economists quietly call the payment reality test. Most buyers focus on the advertised price of a home. That is the trap. Lenders calculate risk using monthly affordability, not sticker price. Before committing to any property, run the numbers assuming mortgage rates of 6% instead of the promotional rates you see today. If the monthly payment still works at that level, you have built a safety margin the market cannot easily destroy. Developers know most buyers never do this calculation. The second strategy is what financial advisors often call the refinancing clock. Millions of homeowners signed fixed-rate deals between 2019 and 2021, when borrowing costs hovered near 1 to 2%. When those deals expire, payments can jump dramatically. Knowing exactly when your fixed term ends gives you time to plan, refinance early, or build savings before the adjustment arrives. Most borrowers wait until the final months. By then, the options shrink quickly. The third strategy is the energy shock buffer. Rising oil prices feed directly into inflation, which influences interest rates. Maintaining even 3 to 6 months of mortgage payments in reserve can turn a financial shock into a manageable inconvenience instead of a crisis. The housing system will not warn you about these risks, but you can prepare for them. Which scenario shocked you the most? Drop your experience in the comments. And if you want to watch a video like this one, click the video on the screen. Thanks for watching.